Sir Angus Deaton is a senior scholar and the Dwight D. Eisenhower Professor of Economics and International Affairs, Emeritus at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs and the Economic Department at Princeton University. In Britain, he taught at Cambridge University and the University of Bristol. He is a corresponding fellow of the British Academy, a honorary fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, a fellow of the Econometric Society, and in 1978 was the first recipient of the Society's Frisch Medal. He was president of the American Economic Association in 2009. In 2012, he was awarded the BBVA Foundation Frontiers of Knowledge Award. In April 2014, he was elected a member of the American Philosophical Society. In April 2015, he was elected a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He is a recipient of the 2015 Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel. In 2016, he was made a Knight Bachelor for his service to economics and international affairs. He was named a member of Politico Magazine's 2016 Politico 50 list of thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics in 2016. He was a recipient, joined with Ann Case, of the 2017 Franklin Founder Award by the organization named Celebration of Benjamin Franklin Founder. In 2019, he was named one of the 38 great immigrants by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Still in 2019, he was named, joint with Ann Case, to Prospect Magazine's 2019 list of World Top 50 Thinkers. Hayes and Deaton jointly received this award for their work in US mortality data. Hayes and Deaton's landmark 2015 study was the first to detect the rise in mortality rates from death of despair, drugs, alcohol, and suicide among middle-aged white Americans. He received in 2019 an honorary Doctor of Letters degree from the University of Cambridge, his alma mater. He is a honorary fellow of the Rimini Center for Economic Analysis and a member of its scientific committee. His main current research areas are in poverty, inequality, health, well-being, economic development, and randomized controlled trials. His current research, in particular, focuses on the determinants of health in rich and poor countries, as well as on measurement of poverty and inequality in the US, India, and around the world. He is also maintaining a long-standing interest in the analysis of household surveys. He is also interested in randomized controlled trials and their limits. He has contributed 177 publications on these topics over his career and has 93,000 citations to his work. So thank you very much, Angus, to be with us today. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Claudia. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to talking. I think I'm going to try to share my screen. Continue. That's stopping someone else's screen sharing, but that's all right. Can you see that? Okay. I'm presuming everybody can see.
Yes, we can see.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So today I'm not going to talk about almost any of the things that Claudia introduced me about. I'm going to talk about COVID-19 and global income inequality. So let me start. This is not what I was working on, but I kept reading this thing. So here's the basic intuition. The pandemic opens up pre-existing inequalities, is sort of become one of the memes of the pandemic. And of course, within countries, it's harder on less well-paid workers. It's not so hard for better paid or better educated who can work from home. And that's going to widen income inequality. Of course, many governments around the world are doing rescue packages of one sort or another, Those rescue packages are very much canted towards poorer people. And so they will either offset or perhaps completely offset. And we don't, I think, know what the net effect in the end on inequality, and it will vary by country. This talk is about international income inequality. And again, the standard argument is that poor countries are likely to suffer more for very obvious reasons. And here's a quote from Joe Stiglitz in Financial Development last year. COVID-19 has exposed and exacerbated inequalities between countries just as it has within countries. The least developed economies have poorer health conditions, true enough. Poorer health systems that are less prepared to deal with a pandemic, also true. And people living in conditions that make them more vulnerable to contagion, all which is true. And they simply do not have the resources that advanced economies have to respond to the economic aftermath. There's also a report from Hopkins, the Economist Intelligence Unit in 2019 about preparedness. And this report is about the Global Health Security Index. And what they did, this is a bunch of economists, epidemiologists, and other people before the pandemic. This is not after the pandemic arrived. And they asked 140 questions that measure country capacity in 6 specific dimensions. Here are the 6: prevention of the emergence and release of pathogens, early detection and reporting for pandemics of potential international concern, rapid response and mitigation of the spread of a pandemic, sufficiency and robustness of the health system to treat the sick and to protect health workers, commitments to improving national capacity, financing, adherence to norms, and the risk environment and vulnerability to biological threats. They had an index for each of these 6 things, and there was an overall index which is aggregated over the 6 dimensions. So what do they show? Well, the United States came out number 1 out of 195. Somalia is last. Number 1, also the United States in preventing pathogens index. The UK is number 2. I should have checked where Italy is, but I don't know. Number 10 in pathogens. Sweden is number 1 on pathogens. And so the countries that were ranked very highly are also the richest countries. And in fact, the correlation with log GDP per capita in purchasing parity dollars is 0.65, 0.62 on pathogens. So the richest countries, not surprisingly, were ranked highest in their putative ability to deal with the pandemic. Yet the correlation during 2020 with deaths per million of the overall index is 0.47. Notice that's positive 0.47. So it's exactly the wrong way read. The best prepared people, according to the index, did worse. It's more than armchair wisdom. This is not just someone sitting in an armchair and making up numbers about what you'd expect us to show. And yet, in spite of all the expertise that went into it and all the empirical data, it's completely incorrect. The message of this for the future is not to attack the people who made this report. And I think without hindsight, almost anyone would have come out this way, which the Stiglitz quote suggests too. But this suggests some humility about what we need to have to face an epidemic like this, or this particular epidemic. So, you know, it's just not clear what are the lessons to be learned about preparedness in the future, given that the best efforts to see who was prepared got this exactly wrong. So what did happen? I have 3 parts to this paper. The first, and I'll show you these in turn. First is that deaths per million are actually positively correlated with income in 2019. So that's income in 2019. The deaths per million are in 2020. Second, the loss of GDP is positively correlated with deaths per million. Countries that lost a lot of people also lost a lot of income. And growth is negatively correlated with income in 2019. So the growth from 2019 to 2020 was worse in the places with higher income, largely as a result of the first two factors. So the last point there need not imply, but it nevertheless is true, that the dispersions of per capita national incomes was lower in 2020 than in 2019. That's just the dispersion country by country. If we weight countries by their population so that Singapore doesn't count the same as China, weight them by population, the dispersion increased. And I will explain why that happens at the end. I also want to note that these results are somewhat fragile. And so if they're interesting at all, they're only interesting because everybody was so sure at the beginning that the opposite was going to happen. There's also no reason to expect these results to hold true in future years. And I also, one of the points I want to make at the end is this sort of exercise raises serious issues about two things that we spend a lot of time thinking about. One is the concept of GDP and the increasing irrelevance of GDP in a globalized world, quite differently from, you know, the standard issues that it misses inequality, that it doesn't take the destruction of the planet into account, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to come to that at the end, just advertising that. There's also real issues to be worried about the relevance of global inequality measures. And I will argue later that it's domestic inequality that's really important even for global issues. I'll come back to that. So important caveats, 2020 alone, the dynamics of the pandemic are unpredictable. The IMF is predicting a very different 2022, that rich countries will do well, poor countries will not do so well. We've seen recently that with its very successful vaccination campaign and large stimulus, the US is likely to grow much more rapidly than Europe in 2021 and 22. In my data, there's no effect of vaccines because there are essentially no vaccines available in 2020. There are lots of measurement error. The 2020 incomes are IMF forecasts made in October 2020. I looked at the January 21 numbers from the World Bank, which are very close. It's also true that deaths are very poorly reported in many countries, even in normal times. So that many poor countries that report very few deaths are not very good at reporting deaths ever. And they presumably didn't do better in the pandemic. Another, perhaps the most important caveat is I'm looking at inequality in per capita incomes, per capita GDP measured in 2017 purchasing power parity dollars. I'm not looking at welfare or material well-being, even consumption in the national accounts, for instance. And even more, I'm not looking at poverty, which we already know is different. Now, poor countries, just because they're poor, are much more sensitive to income declines because there's a lot of people near the poverty line. So if you have a 5% reduction in GDP, it doesn't do much to poverty in America, but it does a lot to poverty in India. So nothing I say is inconsistent with World Bank forecasts of 100 million increase in global poverty in 2020. Using national accounts data, not household survey data, which have a long history of being very different. And I'm using GDP per capita, not even household expenditure per capita from the national income and product accounts. I'll come back to that at the end. So here's the story. Step one, deaths and income. So here's a picture. What we have here along the horizontal axis is the log of per capita income in 2019. It says 2017 purchasing power parity dollars. That's the base year for PPP. This is the log of per capita income in 2019. And on the vertical axis, we have the log of COVID deaths per million inhabitants up to the 31st of December 2020. This comes from our World in Data. The circles have an area that's proportional to the population. So you see India and China equally sized. And then you see Brazil, Mexico, the US, large countries. The black circles are the OECD, and the red circles are countries that are not in the OECD. And you can see this pretty strong positive relationship there. So the population weighted regression coefficient is 0.83 with a T of 4.9. The unweighted regression slope is a bit steeper with a T of 8.6. There's no relationship within the OECD, whether you weight or unweight. Whenever I talk about weighting here, it's population weighting. And clearly, as far as the weighted regression is concerned, much depends on India and China. And you can see India and China, the two big countries, very different positions on this graph. In fact, this success of China having very low number of deaths is a big factor in whatever happens. India has more deaths than average, and that's a pretty big factor too. We'll see that throughout. No, I'm not claiming any causal relationship here. It's not being rich that kills you or gives you COVID. I think people have come to accept this now, but early on, people said this relationship can't be true. The results are garbage. Well, I think it's now pretty well agreed that the results are. This pattern is there. And we're still struggling to find out why it's the case. But why it's the case is of secondary interest to this argument, because however it happened, and that's what's having the effect on global income inequality. However, you can't really talk through these things without mentioning why it looks like, especially given that no one predicted it would look like this. You know, ever since Sam Preston wrote his 1975 paper on what later became known as the Preston curve relating health and wealth, in which we've known forever that richer countries are not only richer, they have better health. So what is going on here? Well, one issue is that poor countries are much younger, and the older countries got hurt much more. There's an interesting paper, excellent paper by Hoevlein and Sen, which does age adjustment. I can show you that a little bit here. Here's age-adjusted COVID mortality. This is from Hoevlein and Chen. You can see some poor countries like Peru or South Africa finish up. This is the 45-degree line, deaths per million. And this age adjustment is called indirect age adjustment, and it sort of pivots around the US. So if you have a younger population in the US, like Peru and Mexico, your deaths get inflated up because you shouldn't have had so many deaths if you had a younger population. On the other hand, here's Italy down here, which is an older population than the US, and it gets a discount factor for that because given the age relation, the risk of mortality rising so rapidly with death, Italy's predicted to have a lot of deaths, and that explains some. If you make the age and sex adjustment, though, and redraw the picture of per capita income against the log of mortality, this has got a much lower slope. So it explains about half is the age structure of population, but only half. So there's still a lot left. So let me go back to this. Obesity also matters. There's a Brookings paper by Penny Goldberg and Tristram Reed. And there's been some more recent work pushing on the obesity story. One of the reasons why East Asian countries may have done so well is that people in Japan and Taiwan, for example, are really quite skinny, and being skinny seems to have a big advantage here, especially for not so old population. Population density matters. Measurement error, I certainly don't want to deny, especially in Africa, that a lot of these numbers are just wrong. It's a criminal offense in Tanzania to count COVID deaths, though maybe that's changed after the president died the other day, perhaps of COVID. Maybe deaths will increase as they spread from rich to poor, from urban to rural. So the pandemic moved essentially first to places on the globalization route, like from Wuhan to Milan, for instance, and then they moved from those trading cities to the rest of the country. And so it might take them a while to get to Africa. Much of Africa is not really on the globalization routes. Warmer countries have activities outdoors. They have lower intermediation in production, so there's less stages, less people involved. They have less transportation, less complex manufacturing, and so there are not, R0 are not, could possibly be lower. There's some recent work suggesting that ultraviolet light, the intensity of ultraviolet light works against the virus, and that would help hotter, poorer countries. And Africa is the continent in which microbes and men, as people used to talk about, humans and bugs co-evolved. And so there's a huge prevalence of infectious disease in Africa, and always has been. And some of those, having had some of those diseases, may infer some sort of cross-immunity. No one's very sure about that. From the US perspective, or the US and British perspective, of course, there's been just an enormous amount of criticism of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson for their handling of the pandemic. And I'm sure a lot of that was justified. But, you know, people go around saying, well, the US has only, has a way disproportionate number of deaths relative to its share of the world population. And that's no worse than many other countries like Belgium, France, UK, Italy, where a lot of you are, Portugal, Poland, etc. And so I think the data we have right now and our understanding means it's much too early to start ranking the performance of countries, quite apart from the fact the pandemic keeps changing. And you are in Italy or in the middle of another wave, and it's very unpredictable. So you've seen those. So we've established that deaths were higher in richer countries. And it turns out also that deaths cripple economic growth. So this is actually a much tighter relationship. So this is log of deaths per million now on the horizontal axis, the predicted growth of GDP per capita. And that's predicted by the IMF, not predicted by the regression. And what you can see here is there's a pretty tight relationship now, and places that had a lot of deaths lost a lot of GDP. And China and India are now more or less on this line, whereas they were way off it in opposite directions before. China had very few deaths and had positive growth in 2020. India had quite a lot of deaths and has had negative growth in 2020. And you can see the patterns even hold into the OECD, though not within the OECD. The unweighted slope here is minus 1.5. Weighted slope is smaller, 0.4, 0.7 with a T of 4. This is much tighter than in step 1 and less dependent on the weighting. And as I've said already, China and India are pretty much on the same line. So, you know, the deaths appear to destroy GDP per head. And it's not so surprising. I mean, if you thought of us not a situation in which we had no idea what we were doing, or there was nothing to control infection, let alone vaccines, then a plague that came and killed a lot of people would decrease a lot of GDP per head too. Many people have worried off this. It's not really supportive of a trade-off. Well, it's not supportive of a trade-off between lives and the economy because it's a dynamic process. And as I say here, not your money or your life, but your money and your life. So this is not necessarily an argument for or indeed against lockdowns, because many other mechanisms are at work. Like many people stop work for fear of dying. And for instance, in the US and in many other countries where the IMF have looked, the fear of death, the fear of infection was actually much stronger than the effects of the official lockdowns, though the official lockdowns had their role too. too. There are also a lot of places where the growth data you don't want to believe. I've said Tanzania's growth data is about as reliable as their death data. So step 3 is the sort of one that counts now, which is growth in 2020 and per capita GDP in 2019. So here's the relationship, which is the least tight of all of the relationships. And we've now got the predicted by the IMF. These have a large component of actual data in them too. And what you can see here is that once again, the richest countries, the OECD countries, had lower growth in 2020 than the poorer countries, and presumably largely here because of the pandemic. In fact, one thing I've done here, which was urged by, I think, Gita Gopinath at the IMF, was to replace these. If I go back to the IMF's forecast before the pandemic, and now I can look at the IMF's forecast in October, then the difference in that is the revision downwards due to the pandemic, and this picture looks the same, essentially. So you're pretty sure that this relationship is actually due to the pandemic. Once again, China, very successful, middle-income country, high middle-income country, very few deaths, and you've got growth in 2020. In India, the other way around. So once again, the regression slope here is -1, T is 3.3 unweighted, insignificant when it's weighted. And you can see why it's insignificant when it's weighted, because when you weight things, it's all China and India, and they're going in opposite directions, and they basically destroy the relationship. In the OECD, the richer countries actually grew faster, but the slope is not significantly different from 0. When I say grew faster, what I'm talking about is shrunk not as much. Its negative growth was, anyway, if you see what I mean, I'll get myself in a twist by saying that. But it grew faster is correct, but mostly we're dealing with negative growth here. Notice, for those of you who followed the growth literature over the years, a negative regression slope does not imply that country by country inequality has fallen. Inequality depends not only on the regression, but on the deviations from the line. This is like a regression to the mean type issue. In growth economics, we've learned that we have to distinguish between sigma convergence, which is the variance across countries getting smaller, which is what we're interested in here, and beta convergence, which is a negative slope in the regression you've just seen. So now we have to talk about inequality per se. And this, Branko Milanovic has done really important work on this. And he has a book called Worlds Apart. And he distinguishes 3 concepts, which I need to get straight. Concept 3 is inequality between all the citizens of the world. So forget there's any country, everybody is just a citizen of the world, and we calculate like the Gini coefficient for everybody in the world. So this obviously takes into account within country inequality and between country inequality. It's all in there. And it also requires data, which I don't have here, on within country distribution. So concept 3 is not something that I can give you any numbers on, though I can say things about it. So concept 2 is between country inequality weighted by population. So that's how it's defined. Now that would coincide with concept 3 if everyone in each country had the mean per capita income, i.e. there was no inequality in countries at all. So, let's come along, share equally in every country, and then calculate global inequality. Now, it's true, it didn't used to be true sort of prehistorically or, before the Enlightenment and the Great Divergence, where most inequality was in countries. Now, concept 3 inequality is dominated by concept 2 inequality. The big differences are between countries, not within countries. So even given that concept 3 inequality is hard to measure and only Branko has all the files, then concept 2 is of interest, even if you're really interested in concept 3. Now, concept 1, then, is the last of the 3, going backwards here. It treats each country as a unit, which is like each country is a person, and calculates inequality between them. And I mean, it's easy to criticize this because, it ignores population size. Albania counts the same as China. But it's the obvious thing that people think about because they think about countries moving apart. And, lay people who think about inequality, often this is the first thing that they think about. And so it's of some interest from that point of view. Okay, so here's pictures of what happened. So the black lines are concept 1, the red lines are concept 2. So if we start with concept 1, which is what most commentators have been talking about, start with the solid lines. And what you can see is that this was rising up until about 2000, but then this has been falling since then, a little bumpy. And between 1990, sorry, I'm in the last century. Between 2019 and 2020, it fell a notch, okay? So what's that, how do we know that's anything to do with the pandemic? It's just not what was happening anyway. Well, there's an unconditional statement which is still of interest because people said the pandemic would drive countries apart, and we're not seeing countries being driven apart here. Just as a cross-check, the dotted lines are what happens if I use the pre-pandemic data. That's the IMF forecasts before anyone had ever heard of the pandemic. And what you can see was going down anyway, and it's gone down a little bit faster. So that's the sort of evidence that this is the pandemic. You might say, why are these two lines not the same? The two lines are not the same because, unfortunately, the international data switched from a 2011 basis for PPPs to a 2017 basis for PPPs. And those data, every time the PPPs change, global inequality changes a bit. And you can see they're in the same general direction, but they're not the same series. So what about concept 2, the population weighted one, which is the one you'd probably be most interested in if you're interested in global income inequality around the world, all people. Then there's a bigger gap between the pre and post. Post-pandemic ones are a little higher. So again, start with a solid line. So this is what actually happened. You can see this little tick up here. And if you take the data before the pandemic, again, there's a difference in the two lines, but this one keeps going down. So you can reasonably think of that as an uptick that was caused by the pandemic. So what's going on here? So concept 1 is narrowing because of the lower growth of richer places. So that's been true. This decline in general is because China and India have been growing much more rapidly than the United States or the OECD. So concept 2, back off. Concept 1 is narrowing during the pandemic because of the lower growth of richer places during the pandemic, which was the first graph you saw. Concept 2 is widening, not because the poorest countries are doing worse than the richer countries, but because India did so badly. And if India is excluded, it goes on narrowing. So here's a picture here. Again, take the red lines here. That's this is the graph you've just seen, the black one in the middle. If you exclude India, that tick up is turned to a tick down using pre or post pandemic. Okay. Excluding China doesn't have much effect. So if you look here, this is all countries. If you exclude China, there's more inequality in the world, but the tick up is the same if you exclude China as if you don't exclude China. Now, China is just very interesting in all this, not only because it had such a good performance in terms of deaths and everything else, but because China is not really a poor country anymore. In fact, it's not a poor country at all by global standards. And here's some numbers. There's 4.5 billion people live in countries poorer than China, only 2 billion in countries richer than China. So China, we've often heard, for people who are interested in concept 2 and concept 3, that world inequality is falling because China is growing so fast. And historically, over the last 30, 40 years, the growth in China has brought, more than 1 billion people from the bottom of the world income distribution up to something like the middle. And that's had a huge effect in reducing concept 2 and concept 3 global inequality. A lot of something that lots of people, lay people, don't really appreciate. However, one of the things about growing very rapidly is if you grow rapidly enough for long enough, you get rich. And then if you get rich, making Chinese people even richer is going to make global inequality more unequal, not less unequal. So China is now close to the point where its rapid growth makes the world more unequal, which is the opposite of what's happened for the last 40 years. And this process has not come to an end yet. So that's why the success of China in 2020 didn't have much effect on the trend in concept 2 inequality. All right. So let's talk a little bit about small and large. And concept 1 versus concept 2. 1 is sensitive to Macau. Macau is, across the bay from Hong Kong. It's sort of gambling mecca. That's, according to, is a separate country in many of these metrics from China. And it's tiny. I mean, it has a population of 670,000 people. So concept 1 is as sensitive to what happens in Macau as to what happens in China. Concept 2, you might say, well, that's better because it doesn't do that to you. On the other hand, concept 2 is sort of like retelling the story of China and India and not much else. So it depends on purpose, but it's not clear what global inequality measures are for. I'll come back to that in a sec. So here's something that may surprise you. If you go to these IMF data and you say, what is the richest country in the world? What's the country with the largest PPP per capita in the world in 2019? And the answer is our friend Macau. Macau has a population of 670,000 people, about the size of a city, which it is. The IMF projected in 2020 that its per capita GDP would be cut more than a half, not because of pandemic deaths, but because it's a tourist gambling place. A lot of entertainment there. It's sort of like Las Vegas of the East. And the IMF said that its GDP would be cut more than a half because that tourism main source of business just eliminated. So if you exclude Macau, you might say, well, let's exclude Macau because, we don't want everything to depend on what happens to this tiny place. Well, then you get back to the situation where concept 1 does actually increase, not decrease. So maybe you should drop Macau. Maybe, but we need to know why. We also need to have a rule which tells us at what population cutoff we should exclude countries in these sort of calculations. I just have a note here that the sensitivity extends to the choice of inequality measure. I computed a lot of Lorentz consistent inequality measures like the tile, the Gini, Angus, and so on. They're all fine, but the standard deviation of logs gives the wrong answer here. And it's known to be Lorentz inconsistent, so maybe I shouldn't have been using it anyway. I just make that point because most economists who are not inequality specialists use the variance of logs or the standard deviation of logs all the time because it's such a convenient measure. And you can evaluate it in Stata without any special commands or something of the sort. Well, it's dangerous is the answer. Okay. So let's go back to this richest country. Which are we going to cut out? So here's the 12 richest countries from the 2017 International Comparison Program. This comes from a paper, not actually in this paper, a paper with Paul Schreier, who's the chief statistician of the OECD, and we've been thinking about these things together. So here's GDP per capita. Macau is not here because Macau actually wasn't in the 2017 ICP, and its numbers were imputed from an earlier round. So here you've got GDP per capita and actual individual consumption. So actual individual consumption is household consumption plus consumption provided by the state, like education and health and so on. So what you can see here is these countries at the beginning here are pretty small: Luxembourg, Qatar, Singapore. Here's Ireland, which is not so small. Ireland's like 5 million people. You probably wouldn't want to be excluding Ireland from your calculations. Here, Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, then Switzerland, which is what, 13 million people? The UAE, Norway, Brunei, then the United States, and then Hong Kong. So what is really notable about these countries is that GDP is much larger than consumption. And you can see in, that's true of Macau too. So that if you're looking at GDP, it's giving you very little idea of what actual consumption is. So in the US, which is a big country, something like 70% of GDP is actual individual consumption. In Qatar, it's like 20%. Even in Ireland, it's like 25%. So these things, you might say, well, why is GDP so much larger than actual individual consumption? And the answer is because there's a lot of corporate profits in there. In a world of globalized capital, globalized intellectual property rights, companies, multinational companies can move their headquarters to Ireland, save taxes, and they have a huge positive effect on Irish GDP, none of which reaches Irish people in their actual consumption. So these countries, I think I've said all this, they have very low shares of consumption in GDP. They're largely, according to the OECD, either investment hubs, meaning places where people come to make large investments, usually because they don't pay taxes, or they're resource rich. And so you're looking at the profits of oil companies or something. Some of these are not so small, including Ireland or Switzerland. To give you an idea of how GDP can be so misleading, Ireland's GDP rose by 26% in 1 year from 2014 to 2015. This is not some weird country. This is a country in the EU, a rich country, one of the richest in the world. This was not a revision and not an error. Like in Nigeria in 2014, they revised the national accounts and you get a huge increase in GDP. This is for real. And it's for real because of these capital transactions that are moving around the world. So in a globalized world with footloose capital, including intellectual capital, GDP can be a really poor indicator of anything to do with material living standards. So this is an additional strike against GDP over and above the things we knew already, that it doesn't take distribution into account, that it doesn't take the using up of the planet, all that sort of stuff. So it's not safe to use GDP to project changes in consumption, which is what the World Bank does when it's projecting poverty before its household surveys are available. So, excuse me, I'm going to have to sneeze. So here's some conclusion. Because I'm not a graduate student on the market, I can say things like this. My results are not very important, and they probably won't hold for long. And what comes out of this paper, in some sense, is more about methods and national accounts than it is about the effects of the pandemic. Even so, it should be a cautionary story that what seems obvious may not be true, and it's always a good thing to look at the data. The results say nothing about poor countries suffering more than rich countries because of the pandemic. It's only about per capita income. But the lesson is to be careful and look at the data. The other big point is that China is no longer a poor country. And so the effects of China's growth on global inequality is changing. The other thing, and maybe we could talk about this in discussion, is people say, why are you interested in global inequality? And people are interested in the effects of globalization. They're interested, obviously, in poverty and disparities across the world. But if you think of the political economy these days, it's domestic inequality, and I'm not sure it's income inequality, but domestic inequality, that, if you like, is responsible for Donald Trump being elected, it's responsible for Brexit. It's this set of people being left behind, people who are not really involved in politics or whatever, and who've done very badly, and actually who in the US, whose life expectancy has been falling for a decade. It is that sort of domestic inequality that's causing upheavals in politics, and those upheavals in domestic politics are threatening the international and global order. So if you ask me which is more important right now at this moment in time, it's the domestic inequalities that we should be looking at, not the international ones. And finally, GDP is terribly misleading about material well-being in a world with global capital and competition by tax havens. So I have some acknowledgements of a lot of people, including NIA, who funded some of this work, and a lot of very kind people who made comments on various versions of this paper, which I think is coming out very shortly in the LSE Public Policy Review, and a version of it in the Milken Journal.